At this time, Monsieur de Bourmont was in Paris without a post. The Minister of War was suspicious of him and had rendered the Emperor equally suspicious. Monsieur de la Baudoyer, who had taken part in the Russian campaign with him, since he had also served under my brother's orders, admired him, assured the Emperor that he was trustworthy, and secured an audience for him. Doubtless, Monsieur de Bourmont managed to convince the Emperor of his devotion, for he was made a division commander, and his children received scholarships. Shortly afterwards, he went over to the enemy. A new incident occurred which proved to me that the animosity of the European monarchs in regard to the Emperor had not diminished. One day a letter was delivered at my door unsigned, but whose writing I recognized as that of Monsieur Bouteguina, the Russian chargé d'affaires. I learned afterwards that it had been dictated word for word by Emperor Alexander. This is what he said. I have delivered to our angel, an epithet he frequently applied to the Emperor of Russia, all your messages. I find his ideas unalterable. He loves your country and its people. He is sorry for them and separates them from the man who again has become their ruler. No peace, no truce, nor any possibility of reconciliation with this man. All of Europe feels the same. Without this man, any conditions you please. No favoritism toward any party. And once he is eliminated, no more war. I beg to offer you the expression of my respectful devotion. A note in exactly the same terms went to the Duc de Visant's Caulaincourt. We considered it our duty to communicate these to the Emperor in order that he might make no mistake as to what Europe thought of him and of France. I was the more anxious to do this when I learned that my brother had just informed him of the immense preparations all the foreign powers were making to wage war against France and how impossible it would be to resist them. My brother added that he advised him to have himself re-elected emperor and then abdicate in favor of his son. When I turned over Monsieur Bouteguina's letter to him, he read it without betraying the slightest emotion. And as he gave it back to me, all he said was, "It's just the same as the one Caulaincourt received." What were his real impressions? Did he imagine that it was some trap the foreign powers had set for him in order to make him separate his personal cause from the national one and thus allow them to triumph more easily? Or did he, on account of the enthusiasm which had greeted his return, feel that his genius could conquer all obstacles? That it was his duty to obey the wishes of the public and believe he must be victorious, especially when he realized what nation it was that so expressed its faith in his power? I leave it for others to judge. An idea which particularly preoccupied the emperor was the degree of affection which Empress Marie-Louise still felt for him. Her major domo had just arrived in Paris. He was an intimate friend of Monsieur de Vaux, who was still in my employ. The Empress's steward told Monsieur de Vaux that the Emperor had sent for him and asked many questions regarding the Empress. The servant was asked what letters he had brought with him to deliver. There was only one for the Duchesse de Montebello, and he had not dared hand this over to the Emperor because he knew it contained this sentence: "I am closely watched, but you who know my opinions know how unnecessary this is." Since, on the other hand, the steward feared to get into trouble if he attempted to conceal the truth, he came to ask Monsieur de Vaux to advise him what course to pursue. Monsieur de Vaux referred the matter to me. This is what I told him. Who employs this majordomo? He should carry out his employer's orders. To do otherwise is to betray his mistress and fail in his duty. My advice was taken. The letter was delivered to the Duchesse de Montebello, and the Emperor knew nothing about it. All the reports we received agreed that Empress Marie-Louise had declined to return to France. The Emperor seemed hurt by this desertion. I noticed this one day when he was speaking sympathetically to me about my mother and said, "I have no portrait of Empress Josephine. I should be pleased if you gave me one." I sent him one which Quaglia had painted on a porcelain cup. The preparations for the ceremonies of the Champ de Mai were now completed. The delegations of electors were arriving from every part of France, as well as delegates from all the regiments in the army. The cabinet ministers were supposed to receive them. The emperor wished me to attend an evening reception by Carnot, Minister of the Interior. I did so. The gathering was a large one, and the musical part of the program was executed by the students of the conservatory. The concert ended with a song of mine, which the refrain was, "We must defend our country." It was very appropriate, but I was almost embarrassed by the effect it produced. Before leaving, I spoke to everyone and received from the heads of the delegations and the deputies the most solemn assurances of their devotion and affection for the emperor's dynasty. Yet so many professions of loyalty, although too spontaneous not to be sincere, did not make much of an impression upon me when I stopped to think that a momentary setback would destroy their effect. The day on which the ceremony of the Champ de Mai was to take place arrived at last. The emperor was again to be proclaimed head of the French nation by a gathering of its representatives. The scene on the Champ de Mars was a most magnificent and impressive one. The center of the great field was filled with troops of the National Guard. A special enclosure was reserved near the École Militaire for the legislative bodies and the delegations from the army. The latter bore the former flags, the tricolors which they had been so reluctant to surrender, and which were about to be blessed and returned to them. Opposite the throne was an altar surrounded by the clergy, and behind the throne a gallery for the princesses and the members of the court. When the emperor appeared, tumultuous cheers broke out. The Te Deum was sung, but its solemn strains were interrupted by the sounds of military music. The soldiers, whose martial aspect made them seem capable of defying the entire universe, assumed an attitude of devotion as they solicited divine protection on the cause they were about to defend. The masses of spectators, by their silence, following their frantic outburst of joy, seemed to share the solemnity of the moment. The entire character of the ceremony was most awe-inspiring. In the speeches made to the emperor, the following phrases were particularly noticed and attracted the most attention. "We will no longer accept those rulers whom foreign powers have imposed on us. We cannot trust their promise. They cannot trust our oaths of allegiance. We wish rulers whom France shall herself have chosen." At this moment, a vast cry went up, "Long live the emperor!" A few scattered shouts were heard of, "Long live the empress!" Suddenly, the officers rose and exclaimed, "We shall go and bring her back." The moment was a dramatic one on account of the emotion that prevailed and the unanimity of sentiment which made failure seem impossible. Yet when I momentarily turned my eyes from the martial display before me, I conjured up a vision of those other armies, the leagued forces of all Europe bearing down upon us, and our defenders, this little group of heroes who alone would resist them and who might be annihilated in a few days' time. I cannot describe what gloomy forebodings filled my heart. Several persons noticed my emotion, and when the emperor had proceeded to the middle of the Champ de Mars, where he was to distribute the eagles and review the troops, the Duc de Trente, Fouché, stepped up to me to inquire the reasons for my mournful air. I replied, "Beyond all this ceremony lies the menace of war, and that idea is a dreadful one." "What else can you expect?" he said. "The emperor has just missed a great opportunity. I advised him to abdicate today. Had he done so, his son would have succeeded to the throne, and war would have been avoided." "Alas," I answered, "the thought of that conflict is a torture to me. But it would have needed more than human qualities not to have been affected by all this enthusiasm. Perhaps, too, the emperor thought that instead of placing his son on the throne, his retirement would merely have hastened France's downfall. It was natural, when I saw so many of my country's brave defenders gathered together in one mass, that I should think of my brother, who was absent. He still formed a target for jealous hatred. Doubts were expressed regarding his fidelity to the imperial cause, and the emperor himself said to me one day, 'Why does your brother not come back? One can always escape in disguise. A man can always go anywhere if he really wants to.' 'Sire,' I replied, 'you know he's in danger of being imprisoned if he does not remain neutral, and he is not a man to break his word.' After the ceremony of the Champ de Mai, we also attended the opening of parliamentary session. The days that followed were taken up by farewells, which had never been more painful. For although we never had a more just cause to defend, we had never been faced with more obstacles. The day set for the emperor's departure for the front was a Sunday. During the family dinner, which always took place on that day of the week, he seemed in high spirits. I may be wrong, but this gaiety appeared to me to be assumed. He spoke about literature and was more talkative than usual. Madame Bertrand, whom I saw afterwards, was worried and told me that before entering the drawing room, he had sent for her to come into his private reception room to say goodbye, and had made the following remark: "Well, well, Madame Bertrand, may we not have cause to regret the island of Elba." This doubt as to his success had alarmed her, for it was unusual, and I too was frightened to hear of it. That evening he received all his cabinet ministers. I brought him my children to say goodbye. He did not dismiss us until quite late, and he left Paris before daybreak. The Prince of Equimaux had remained in command of the garrison of Paris. This was somewhat reassuring, as our position resembled so much that of the year before that we feared a similar outcome. I remained at home, seeing little of the Emperor's brothers, who treated me as a complete outsider. I heard only the most important items of news through the newspapers. Private letters informed us that the welcome the emperor received in the provinces and from the troops fully equaled that which we had witnessed in Paris. Soon afterwards, the sound of cannon told us of a first victory, but how many more victims would still be required? The news of another military success, the more melancholy since it was gained against our countrymen, reached us from Vendée. Monsieur de la Rochejacquelin had been killed while fighting bravely for his cause. People rejoiced at the news in my presence. I replied, we should feel sad at being in a position that causes us not to regret the death of a Frenchman. A feeling which I could not explain made me want to go and see some corners of Paris I did not know, and which I imagined I might be seeing for the first and last time. I visited Bercy, stopped at the house of Madame de Nicolay. There I met General de Roche-Aymon, who had always been an ardent supporter of the Bourbons. He related what the Faubourg Saint-Germain was saying about me. Their dislike was so violent, and the stories they told so grotesquely exaggerated, that we could not help laughing about it. Not only was I supposed to have taken an active part in bringing back the emperor, but I was also accused of having ordered General Quesnel to be thrown into a river, although I had never even heard of a general by that name. Nevertheless, I was surprised to hear Monsieur de la Roche-Aymon make fun of the seriousness with which the Duc de Berry had planned his campaign until March 20th. I should have thought the only feeling that the fate of a family in distress and exile could arouse would be one of sympathy. On the contrary, I frequently heard jests made at their expense. Marshal M, for instance, who believed he was doing his duty when he conducted the king to the French frontier and refused any other post afterwards, allowed himself to ridicule the hasty flight and embarrassed attitude of the king. A man no longer young. One must always be fortunate in order to escape criticism. I had given Monsieur Benjamin Constant an appointment to read me a short novel he had just written. We had reached the climax of the narrative and were all in tears, including the author, when word came that the Duc de Rovigo wished to speak to me. He informed me that ugly rumors were circulating and that it was said that we had been defeated. That evening, his wife and General Sebastiani called. They asked to speak to me privately. Their first words were, "All is lost. Our army has been wiped out. The emperor will be here tonight, although he did everything he could to be killed." Alas, I queried hurriedly, "Have many Frenchmen fallen?" "None of our friends," replied the general. "I have just left King Joseph, and I read all the dispatches he has received. The disaster is complete. More than 30,000 men lie on the battlefield." "Ah, our poor Frenchmen," I exclaimed. I felt all my courage leave me. But I quickly regained control of myself as the full extent of this new blow dawned on me. Good fortune had definitely abandoned us. But the more cruel the wound, the greater need for energy to resist its effects. I said to the general, "Our cause is hopeless, but I trust all is not lost for France. We must keep cool." Should not word be dispatched to General Rapp, who is in command at Strasbourg, telling him at all costs not to surrender the city to the enemy, but to be prepared to resist? All our efforts must be bent to the task of escaping the foreign invasion. The general replied, "The emperor will be here tonight. He has doubtless already thought of that." I returned to my drawing room, and no one guessed by my attitude that anything special had taken place. The next morning, I heard the emperor was back. I at once hastened to the Élysée, filled with emotions I cannot put into words. He was in conference with his brothers, I did not see him. I went to see Madame Bertrand. She was with her husband and gave me details of what had taken place. The emperor had only returned in order to ask the Senate and Chamber of Deputies for more support. He still hoped all was not over and had dispatched his aides-de-camp to rally the scattered troops. I said to General Bertrand, the emperor's cause is really lost this time. It was a question of winning a single battle. He is mistaken if he thinks he will meet with a reception similar to that which brought him to Paris. The French are so changeable. Had he won, everybody would have been on his side. He has been defeated. No one will support him. Why did we ever leave Elba? Suddenly asked Madame Bertrand. What would become of the emperor now? The idea oppressed all of us. I should have wished him to leave immediately for America. Madame Bertrand, on the other hand, insisted the English, so liberal and enlightened in their ideas, were the only nation worthy of receiving him and capable of understanding him. I went out on foot along the Champs-Élysées, and I sent my carriage to wait for me on the Place de la Concorde. I had Madame Dillon with me. As we passed the gardens of the Élysée, I saw a well-dressed woman talking to a sentry on duty. This seemed to me unusual. I approached quietly, accompanied by Madame Dillon and another lady who was in attendance. I heard the woman say, "You are being deceived. He is lost beyond hope of recovery. He has abandoned his army." To this the sentinel replied, "Go away, I will never desert him." Not being able to see the emperor just then, I returned at 6 o'clock to the Élysée. He was alone in the garden, deeply moved. I advanced to greet him. I cannot tell whether he wished to conceal his own emotion, but he assumed an air of surprise as he inquired, "What is the matter? What have people been telling you?"